Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from two people who were involved in the original refurbishment of the lifts at Grenfell Tower. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Sir, may I call Stephen Ellis?
Good, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Ellis.
Morning, sir.
I gather you're going to make the affirmation. It's there on the screen in front of you. If you'd read it out, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good, thank you very much indeed. Now, do sit down.
Thank you.
Make yourself comfortable. That's it, get yourself some water. Right. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. First of all, would you mind confirming your name for the record?
Stephen Ellis.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Ellis. Thank you for attending today. Before we start, there's three things I should say. First of all, if at any time during your examination you require a break, that's not a problem, just say so. Secondly, if at any time my questions are unclear or too long, please say so, and I'll try to shorten it and make them clearer. And thirdly, it's really important if you keep your voice up during the time you're giving evidence so that the shorthand writer can capture everything. And also, please don't nod or shake your head, just say yes or no as the case may be.
Yes.
Now, you've given two statements to this inquiry. The first one we can find at BUT quadruple 000040 and is dated the 23rd of September 2019. Is that it?
Yes, it is.
And also note that you provide a number of exhibits which can be found at BUT 0000039. We don't need to go to them. Your second statement can be found at BUT quadruple 000055 and is dated the 8th of June 2021. Is that it?
Yes, that is it.
And you provide an exhibit to that, which is SBE 12, which can be found at BUT 0000053. We don't need to go to it, though. Have you read those statements recently?
I have.
And are their contents true?
Yes, they are.
Have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
No, but when I was first contacted by the inquiry, I did discuss the project with some of my former colleagues to ascertain memory, really, that what we could remember and what we couldn't remember about it.
And thank you. One of the colleagues you contacted was Mr. Ian Moorhouse, is that right?
It was.
And in his first statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is at BUT quadruple 000023. He states at paragraph A1 this: on receipt of the email from the inquiry and with the passage of time and events in my life, I had no recall or recollection of the project, and I've since been totally reliant on Butler and Young documentation on disk, and also my former colleague S. Ellis, whilst investigating the issues and responding thereof. Can you help us? What discussions did you have with Mr. Moorhouse regarding the project at Grenfell?
The project in general terms, sir, really. Just what it was, when it was so long ago. We've been retired a long time, he more than me. But that was really just to establish the what, when and why of the scheme.
Thank you. And did you keep any handwritten notes in relation to your involvement in the Grenfell project?
No, sir.
Now, can I first of all look at your background, your training, experience and qualifications? And helpfully you provided a CV, which can be found at BUT 0000041. We don't need to go to it. But is it right that you worked at Otis Elevator Company from 1965 to 1988 as an apprentice and then a sales engineer?
As an apprentice, then an installation engineer, and then a test engineer, and then a sales engineer.
And then you worked at M&E Design Services from 1988 to 1993 as an associate lift consultant, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And then after that you worked at Pickering Lifts from 93 to 94 as a sales engineer.
Yes, sir.
And then from 1995 until your retirement in 2014, you worked as an associate engineer at Butler & Young, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And that there you were a lift consultant with responsibility for all aspects of lift contracts from design, development, project management and commissioning. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And that you carried out project management at the Barbican Estate and RBKC lift refurbishments.
Yes, sir, amongst others.
Now, in terms of your qualifications, have I summarised them correctly? First of all, you have an HNC in Electrical and Electronic Engineering.
Yes, sir.
You also have an HNC endorsement in Computer Engineering, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
An HND endorsements in Electronics and Mathematics.
Yes, sir.
You're a member of the International Association of Elevator Engineers.
Or was.
And are you or were you a member of the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers?
No, sir. Never got there.
Now, if we can look at your training, and particularly your training in relation to the standards that were applicable to lifts at the time of the lifts project at Grenfell. Now, did you receive any training on the British or European standards relating to lifts?
Not specific training, no.
Did you receive anything in terms of general awareness of the existence of the standards?
Oh, yes. We were working with the standards in those days.
Would it be fair to assume, therefore, that in the period with which we're concerned, so 2003, 2004, you received no training on the principles and requirements of British Standard 5588-591, which concerned fire precautions in the design, construction of use of buildings, Part 5, Code of Practice for Firefighting Stairs and Lifts?
No specific training, no.
Would you nonetheless have described yourself as familiar with the requirements of BS 5588-5?
Yes, I would in those days, yes.
And did you have ready access to the British Standard itself?
Yes, sir.
Would you have had a hard copy with you, or is it available on other archive resources at Butler & Young?
I haven't got a copy with me, no.
No, at the time.
Oh, yes, there were copies, hard copies at the office of Butler & Young at that time, yes.
Is it fair, therefore, to assume that you'd received no training on the principles and requirements of BS EN 81-72 2003, which concerns safety rules for the construction and installation of lifts, and particular applications for passenger and goods passenger lifts, firefighter lifts?
No specific training, external training, no.
But nonetheless, would you have described yourself as familiar with the requirements of BS EN 81-72 2003?
At that time, yes.
And again, would you have had ready access to the standard itself?
Yes.
Would it be also fair to assume that you'd received no training on the substantive changes that were brought in November 2004 to British Standard 5588-5?
Yes, that would be correct.
Nonetheless, would you have described yourself as familiar with the changes that were brought in by that revision in November 2004?
Yes, I was at the time.
Again, would you have had ready access to the revised British Standard 5588-5?
Yes.
Would it be fair to assume, given your previous answers, that you received no training on the substance of approved document B, the 2000 edition, insofar as it related to lifts?
Document B, I'm sorry, can you...
Have you ever heard of it?
I can't recall document B.
And so you've never had cause to examine it?
As far as I'm aware, no.
Well, let's just, in case it prompts your memory, you may know that the Secretary of State issues guidance in relation to compliance with the building regulations, and they're called approved documents. Does that ring any bells? The one in particular we're interested in is approved document B.
I must admit, it's not familiar to me.
No, thank you. Right.
Right.
In relation to firefighting lifts, did you receive any specific training at all on the design requirements of a firefighting lift?
No, not specific training. I'd been used to dealing with firefighting lifts since the M&E design days. That was...
So you wouldn't have received any specific training on, for example, the purposes and functions of a firefighting lift?
Not specific training.
Is it fair to say, then, that your knowledge of the relevant standards was derived from practice and experience rather than specific training?
Yes, sir. It would.
Thank you. Can I now turn to your specific position and responsibilities at Butler & Young? Now, as we've dealt with before, you were employed as an associate between 1995 and 2004.
Yes, sir.
And your CV states that you are a lift consultant responsible for all aspects of lift contracts from design all the way through to commissioning. Now, generally speaking, would that role involve you advising clients on the types of lift that were required for the buildings that they were concerned with?
Yes, it would, on occasion.
Now, where regulations did not expressly require a building to have a firefighting lift, but nonetheless it would be good industry practice to install a firefighting lift, for example, would Butler and Young advise the client accordingly?
They certainly would have advised the client of the existence of the standard and the implications of the standard.
And so would it be fair to assume that Butler and Young would advise clients as to whether and in what circumstances it was reasonably practicable to install a firefighting lift, for example?
Yes, it would.
And had you ever had occasion yourself to provide such advice to clients?
I believe so, but I can't really recall at what time.
Would Butler and Young be involved in the design of lifts, generally speaking?
When you say design, the design of the scheme,
Yes.
yes, the design of the scheme would be our responsibility.
And the design of the lift car itself?
Yes,
Would you yourself have had the requisite knowledge and expertise and experience to have designed, for example, a firefighting lift?
yes, sir.
And would you have felt yourself competent to design or to draft the specification for a firefighting lift?
Yes, sir.
Dealing with your previous high-rise residential building experience, before the Grenfell project in 2003, what other experience did you have of lift projects in high-rise residential buildings?
Some estates in Wandsworth, or an estate in Wandsworth, should I say. And one in Birmingham.
And those are the two previous experiences that spring to mind.
They spring to mind. There probably were others, but they spring to mind.
Can you remember whether either or both of those projects involved upgrading lifts, existing lifts, to firefighting lifts?
No, they didn't.
Have you ever been involved, or were you involved before you retired in 2014, in a project that involved upgrading existing lifts to firefighting lift standard?
No.
Now, can I now turn to the relationship between RBKC, the TMO, and Apex? Now, your CV states, as we've touched on, that you're involved in project management of the Barbican Estate and RBKC lift refurbishment. And in your second statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is BUT 0000055/2. You notice that you carried out several projects for RBKC and the TMO, including the 2001 refurbishment of passenger lifts at Broadwood Terrace and Chesterton Square, and in 2003 the refurbishment of 12 passenger lifts in Kensington Town Hall, as well as a refurbishment in 2007 of one lift at the Chelsea Old Town Hall. Did any of those projects involve high-rise buildings?
No, sir, they didn't.
In your experience, did staff at the TMO have professional knowledge of lifts, the design and the regulatory requirements?
Yes, they did.
And in your conversations with them, was it clear that the individuals concerned had sufficient knowledge of the British and European standards that applied to lifts?
Yes.
With whom did you deal with at the TMO who had that experience?
David Steppel, principally, and Roman Kalan to a lesser degree.
By a lesser degree, do you mean your involvement with Mr. Kalan was to a lesser extent than that with Mr. Steppel, or are you saying that his knowledge was less?
I believe his knowledge was less, yeah. I think David Steppel was very knowledgeable.
Had Butler and Young worked with Apex before the Grenfell Tower lift project?
Yes, sir.
Can you give us an idea on how many times in broad terms? Or if you prefer to say regularly, frequently, or rarely, as the case may be?
Fairly frequently. They were one of our selected tenderers and contractors.
I appreciate you're a long time retired now, but can you remember how many of the projects upon which work was done with Apex involved high-rise residential buildings?
Only that one, I think.
Now can I turn to firefighting lifts and the relevant standards? Given your previous answer, you may not have seen this before, but could we go to approved document B, section 1811, which can be found at BRE quadruple 05391/110. And now if we look on the right-hand column, just below the halfway point, you'll see section 18.11. And that states that firefighting shafts should be designed, constructed and installed in accordance with the recommendations of British Standard 5588-5 1991. Even if you had not seen approved document B before, were you aware of that requirement?
Yes.
Was that requirement well known in the industry to the best of your recollection?
Yes, it would be, I would imagine.
Now, can I turn to BS 5588-5? It has a somewhat long title, which, just for the record, is Fire Precautions in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Part 5 Code of Practice for Firefighting Stairs and Lifts. And if we can go to BSI quadruple 01721. Now, this was published in August 1991, and as its title suggests, it's a code of practice. If we can go to page 7 within this document, and section 1, clause 1. There we go. At the top left-hand side, you'll see under the heading Scope, it says this code of practice provides guidance for designers in providing firefighting stairs and lifts to assist the fire service in firefighting operations. Was that a document to which you had regard or reference during the course of the work at Grenfell?
That scope part is not something we would have adhered to in the Grenfell Tower Inquiry project.
Why is it not something to which you would have adhered for the Grenfell lift project?
Because it was agreed that the lifts would not be firefighting, but would remain as firemen's lifts from the discussions with David Steppel and John Rogers.
Okay, we'll come on to that in due course. Now, if we can stay on this page for the moment and look at clause 2.10, there we go, it's on the right-hand side under the heading Firefighting Lift, which is defined thus: a lift designated to have additional protection with controls that enable it to be used under the direct control of the fire service in fighting a fire. And note, the firefighting lift is a development of the type of lift known as a fireman's lift. Although existing fireman's lift installations may be replaced, fireman's lifts should not be used in new installations. Only lifts complying with this code of practice can be designated firefighting lifts. Were you familiar with that definition?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Can you help us? What is the difference between a fireman's lift and a firefighting lift?
Well, the firefighting lift has all the attributes that are described in this standard and that I described in my witness statement of the second witness statement. So the fireman's lift was notably just had to be conformed to dimensional requirements and have a switch at the fire service access level which would be turned over and isolate the lift for use by firefighters. But the control module of that lift would be something akin to what they call car preference control and not the more sophisticated control that was included in the 5588.
Thank you. And if we can stay on this page and look stay on the right-hand column and look at section 2.12, it defines a firefighting shaft thus: a protected enclosure containing a firefighting stair, firefighting lobbies, and, if provided, a firefighting lift together with its machine room. Were you familiar with that definition?
Yes, yes, sir.
And if we could now turn to page 10 within this document. And if we can look at the bottom right-hand corner at clause 3.6, or part 3.6, which is headed provision and number of firefighting shafts. And it says this, and I quote, "The criteria for the provision and number of firefighting shafts in many building types are given either in building regulations or in the relevant part of BS 5588. However, when no such guidance is available, the provision and number of firefighting shafts should be based on the following. A. Buildings or parts of buildings where 1. The height of the surface of the floor of the topmost story, excluding any story consisting exclusively of plant rooms, exceeds 15 metres. Now, stopping there, would you accept that, at least according to BS 55885, if a new building is built, the advice should be that it should have a firefighting shaft, which would include a firefighting lift?
Yes, sir.
And the rationale for including a firefighting lift is simply this, that it would assist evacuation and firefighting efforts in the event of a fire.
Firefighting efforts, I'm not so sure about evacuation. I think that's a different case.
But certainly firefighting efforts.
Certainly firefighting.
Now, in your second statement at paragraph 17, and we don't need to go to it, but the reference is BUT quadruple 000055/17, you state that the view at the time of project one project you were involved in, was that when refurbishing lifts, compliance with BS 5588 was not mandatory. However, in terms of existing buildings, the rationale for installing a fire lift you say that. Now, however, in terms of existing buildings, the rationale for installing a firefighting lift would equally apply to an existing building, wouldn't it? i.e., it would assist firefighting efforts in the event of a fire.
The problem with that is that to call the lift a firefighting lift, you have to comply with this standard or the latest standard in every aspect. Otherwise, you cannot call it a firefighting lift. That's been one of the problems. I could go on a little bit if you like, but...
No, it's really the central point being that you have a very good or a sound safety reason for where the opportunity arises for installing a firefighting lift, insofar as it's reasonably practical to do so, which is to enhance or to improve the prospects of firefighting efforts in the event of a fire. That rationale exists whether it's an existing building or a new building. Would you accept that as a proposition?
Yes, I'll accept that as a proposition.
So would it follow, and please say if you disagree with this, would it follow that even though British Standard 55885 does not expressly say whether lifts installed in existing tall buildings should be upgraded to a firefighting lift, there would be a very sound safety rationale for doing so, i.e. enhancing the prospects of firefighting efforts in the event of a fire?
I can't really say on that. It's difficult to evaluate a set of circumstances where you can't comply with the whole standard and can't call the lift a firefighting lift. What I would say is that the building that we were reviewing, the TMO and ourselves, in 2003 was a very different edifice to what it became, in that it was recognised to be fire secure with very little risk of fire spreading from flat to flat, let alone floor to floor, and that the application of the fireman's lift, as it was, would be more than an adequate tool.
I think the suggestion being made, Mr. Ellis, is that if it were possible, given the physical limitations of the building, but if it were possible to replace fireman's lifts with firefighting lifts, there would be a good safety reason for doing that.
If that could be completely achieved, yes.
Yeah.
Could we turn on to a different standard now, which is BS EN 8172 2003, and if we go to BSI quadruple 01725. Mr. Ellis, can I apologise? There's some slightly odd noise off, which I think, having seen that Ms. Brooks...
We've got a crackling noise from something over in that sort of corner of the room.
It is. It's subject to investigation, but I've seen Mrs. Brooks leave the room, so I suppose
All right, well,
it's just to apologise to Mr. Ellis that there's noises off.
yeah, I'm sorry about that, Mr. Ellis. We'll see if we can get it sorted out. But
I'm used to noises, officer.
Now, we've got the standard up there. It's, as you've indicated, you're familiar with its requirements. Now, it was published on the 22nd of July, 2003. If we could go to page 7 within this standard, and again, section 1, which defines scope, and in particular 1.2. Now, you can see there in the second and third dash points under 1.2 that the standard says it does not apply to lifts installed in existing buildings or to important modifications to existing lifts installed before the publication of the standard. And it goes on to state that, quotes, however, the standard may usefully be used as a basis, and that says that at the end of clause 1.2. Would it therefore follow that this standard could provide a basis for the design and requirements of a firefighting lift in an existing building?
It could.
Can I turn now to a separate standard, which is BS 5588-5 2004, so the revision of the original standard, which can be found at BSI quadruple 01723. There we go. You've already indicated that you're familiar with its requirements. It was published on the 22nd of November 2004, and obviously by that point, the lift project at Grenfell had started. Is that right?
Sorry, the date was?
26th of November 2004.
It had started in the sense of off-site. It hadn't started on-site at that time.
If we could go to page 18 within this document, and the very bottom of that page, if possible. And we see there at the bottom clause 7, firefighting facilities, 7.1, firefighting shafts, and 7.1.1, provision of firefighting shafts. The standard says this, and I quote, firefighting shafts should be provided in tall buildings, buildings with deep basements, and buildings with large floor areas. And if we could hold that in mind, but turn over the page, we should see table 4, which is subtitled provision of firefighting shafts. And in the top row on the left-hand side, it says this, buildings or parts of buildings where the height of the surface of the floor of the topmost story, excluding any story consisting entirely of plant rooms, exceeds 18 metres, should be provided with firefighting stair, firefighting lobbies provided with a fire main, firefighting lift installation. Now, would you agree, and please say if you do not, that it is clear from this standard that new tall buildings, i.e. new buildings over 18 metres, should have a firefighting lift?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that the rationale for installing a firefighting lift would apply equally to an existing building too, i.e. that it facilitated the work of firefighters in the event of a fire?
It's a difficult one to answer. It's not a thing that was the industry standard at the time to concern the design with changing what was there in that sense.
Now, if we could look at that a bit further, where you do have a building such as Grenfell, where you had, as an existing building, you had existing lifts, are you saying that the industry approach would have been not to enhance the existing lift facilities at all?
I think in most cases that would be true. Again, we come back to this, unless you do everything, you can't call it a firefighting lift. So it can be, there is a theory that it can be confusing. There are some publications that have said if you cherry pick certain things that are appended to a fireman's lift, but not making it a firefighter, it actually causes confusion to the fire service. And they're better off knowing that it's either a firefighting lift or it's a fireman's lift. Or they haven't got one at all, one of those.
I hope I don't put this too crudely, but was it an all or nothing approach, therefore, that was adopted? If you couldn't provide all the features of a firefighting lift, you simply didn't do it and kept the lifts as they were?
Yes, that was basically it.
and although we'll come on to this, and apologies for probably straying away from the standards at this point, was that the attitude that Mr. Steppel took when this question on your evidence was discussed in May 2003 or thereabouts?
Yes, as I remember, that is exactly what it was.
And was he the one who volunteered that view, or was that view prompted by discussion with yourselves and others at Butler and Young?
No, that was his view. That was very definitely David's view.
You say very definitely his view. Was it in the manner of an instruction or a direction, or was there some discussion of the point?
There was discussion, but in the end it was a direction from David.
Now, apologies for straying into that conversation, but we'll come on to it in more detail later, but I thought it was useful there to deal with it. Could I stay on the technical side of matters and look at the requirements of a firefighting lift? And really exactly what was required for a lift to be classified as a firefighting lift in accordance with the relevant standards. Now, if I summarise matters incorrectly, please shout.
Okay.
But am I right in understanding, first of all, that the standards require, first of all, a lift car, certain dimensions, material of limited combustibility, and it must run its course in 1 minute?
Yes.
Secondly, it should have a lift car trapdoor so that an individual trapped inside could escape.
That is part of the standard, certainly, yes.
Water protection, to protect the installation from water which might enter during a firefighting operation.
Yes, two methods are required, I think, from my memory.
But in broad terms, I've summarised it.
Yes, indeed.
Fourthly, a fire control switch and associated system is required to bring the lift under the control of firefighters when required.
Yes.
Fifthly, a fire service communication system and intercom.
Yes.
A secondary power supply.
Yes.
Now, if we can look at certain specific elements of those requirements, and in particular the fire control switch, and if for that purpose we could go to BSI 0001728. Now, this is not a standard we've looked at yet, but it's another British standard. It's 5655-11, 1989, and it concerns, as it sets out there, the engineering and safety features to be incorporated when modernising electric lifts. And if we could go to page 5 within this document, and the very bottom, or rather, you see there on the right-hand column, 2.4, modernisation by alteration. Existing installations, apologies, the word existing is obliterated by the watermark. And if we could turn over the page to page 6, we see at the very top left-hand corner, it says this: where the controller of a fireman's lift is changed, the control system should comply with BS 5588 Part 5. This does not, however, imply compliance with all other requirements in that standard for a firefighting lift, especially with regard to the structural enclosure. Now, am I right in understanding that that meant that any new fire control system should comply with 5588-5?
Yes.
And that applied irrespective of whether the works were a modernisation or an installation of a new lift?
Yes.
And there's no caveat anywhere in the standard otherwise?
No, I don't believe so.
Now, could I draw the various strands we've been discussing together, and please shout if I've got anything wrong or you feel is too crudely summarised. First of all, at the time of Project 1, in your view, did the relevant standards or any other legislation or guidance require the installation of firefighting lifts in new buildings?
No. Oh, in new buildings?
In new
yes.
buildings.
Yes.
Secondly, at the time of Project 1, in your view, did the relevant standards or any other legislation or guidance require the installation of firefighting lifts in existing buildings?
No, they did not.
Did you consider that it was industry good practice to at least consider at development and the design stage whether as many of the features of a full firefighting lift could be installed in existing tall buildings such as Grenfell?
No, we did not.
Is your evidence that, as a matter of industry experience, there would have been no consideration of such additional features, maybe not all of them, of a firefighting lift that could be incorporated so as to enhance the safety profile of the relevant lift?
It didn't seem to be, well, it wasn't an industry typical standard. It was the industry would either completely convert or install in new buildings a firefighting lift, or refurbishment would be just a repetition of the fireman's lift.
Now, one of the points which I should put to you in light of that evidence is that you're aware that the inquiry has retained its own lift expert, Mr. Roger Howkins.
Yes, I am.
And that if we go to his report, it can be found at RHO /00003/118 and paragraph 248. And he says this in the opening sentence: regardless of whether the lifts were considered new or modernised, good practice would have been to consider if the lifts could be fully upgraded to the firefighting standard so far as was reasonably practicable. Now, is it fair to say that you disagree with that conclusion of Mr. Howkins for the reasons you've just given?
Yes, I do.
Can I now turn to a separate topic, which is the scale of the project at Grenfell with which you were involved? And for this purpose, could I ask you to go to your first statement, which can be found at BUT quadruple
I'm
zero.
sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Kinnear. I think, if I've understood you correctly, Mr. Ellis, what you're saying is whether Mr. Howkins or anyone else would regard it as good practice, the industry didn't do it. And it wasn't industry practice.
It wasn't generally industry practice, sir, no.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Sorry, Mr.
No, thanks, sir. So we're about to go to your first statement, BUT quadruple zero 0040/4, and paragraph A12A, which is three rows down from the top of the page, and you say this: Butler and Young did not consider the two refurbished lifts as new lifts. Significant equipment was retained. Now, at paragraph 14 of your second statement, which can be found at BUT 0000055/5, you say this, that Butler and Young considered that the two passenger lifts at Grenfell Tower comprised a refurbishment because significant equipment was retained. This retained equipment included guide rails, guide bracketry, counterweight and landing back boxes. From recollection, the term refurbishment was employed on every document throughout the project, close quotes. Now, probably useful to go to this. Could we go to paragraph 223 of Mr. Howkins' report, which can be found at RHO 00003/111. And he says there that, and he quotes there the section of 565511, 2005, in which a new lift is defined as either where the lift is totally replaced or where only the guide rails are retained. Would you agree that that is the appropriate definition of a new lift to be deployed here?
Sorry, can I
Yes, of course.
review that again?
Yeah, if you look at, I'll let you read paragraph 223, and this is Mr. Howkins' report. I'll just let you read that.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. And would you accept that is the definition of a new lift that was relevant here?
Yes, I would accept that.
Now, bearing in mind that definition, can we look at what work was done to the lifts at Grenfell Tower and see whether, and if so, to what extent it satisfies that definition? Now, the project required the replacement of, amongst other things, the complete lift car, would you agree?
Yes, it did.
The counterweight?
I'm not sure of the counterweight. I can't remember. Apex, in their returns, claimed they were going to retain counterweight.
The car sling and platform?
That was replaced.
Safety gear?
Yes.
Door operator?
Yes.
car doors,
Yes.
landing doors,
Yes.
the landing control system,
By that you mean the when you say landing control system, you mean the push buttons and
Yes.
Yes.
lift pit buffers,
Yes.
electrical wiring,
Mostly, I think. Yes.
the lift controller,
Yes.
and the lift motor gearbox.
Yes.
So I think the only doubt you entertained there was over the counterweight. Is
Yeah.
that a fair summary?
And the landing back boxes, which were retained.
Now, just following on from that, if we could turn to the specification, which we'll discuss in further detail in due course. If we go to BUT 0000044/12 and paragraph 1.3.1. Now, it's summarised there, the retained equipment as being essentially twofold. First of all, guides and single riser of car guide brackets and landing back boxes. Is that a fair summary of what was retained?
That was what we suggested would be retained in the specification. Yes.
And am I right in understanding that even though the car guides were retained, they were relocated to
Ye-
accommodate a larger car size? Is that
Yes, they
right?
were.
So, certainly from the lay perspective, it would appear that the vast majority of the component parts of the lifts were actually replaced as part of Project One. Would you accept that proposition?
Yes, I would.
Would you therefore accept, and please shout if you do not, that the lifts ought to have been considered as new lifts, bearing in mind the definition we looked at earlier?
I didn't think so.
And can you help us as to why you didn't think so, given the scale of the change to the lift apparatus?
I always regarded it as a refurbishment. If the counterweight was retained and the guides and the bracketry and the landing back boxes, that was, in my opinion, a sensible definition of a refurbishment.
And when you were looking at what the definition of a refurbishment was, is it fair to assume that you wouldn't have gone back to the relevant standards to see what the regulatory definition of a new lift was?
No, I probably didn't.
And you would have relied upon your own expertise and experience in the field?
I would.
Thank you. Given the extent of the change to the, if I can call it the lift apparatus, would you accept that there was the possibility of an opportunity to upgrade the lifts and make modifications so that they had more of the features of a firefighting lift?
It might have been considered early on, but as we've already said, that the discussions were with the TMO went differently.
Just following on from that, just for the sake of completeness, given the scale of the works, given their duration, I think given the contract value was £631,000 odd, would you have approached this project as being a major project?
Oh yes, certainly.
Would that have been another factor which went into the mix to consider whether these lifts were new or not, and therefore whether their capacity or their safety capability should be enhanced?
No, I don't think so.
And by that you're saying you didn't view it in that way?
No, I didn't view it that way.
Now, if I can now turn to Butler & Young's initial involvement with the lift project, and first of all, the project brief itself. Now, in or about August 2002, the TMO produced a project brief for the potential lift consultants for the lift works at Grenfell. And if we can go to TMO 00853-783, hopefully we see that document. But we do not.
We do it on that's an email, isn't it?
Well, let's see. If we can go to TMO 00853-783/12. Better luck that time. Have you seen that before?
Only recently.
So we can take it that you did not see it in 2002, 3
No,
or 4?
I did not. I certainly can't remember seeing it in that time, and that was assumedly seen during the fee tender process.
Okay, if we could go back to page 1 in this document, please. And again, sorry, page 2. That front page is fairly nondescript. Does that prompt any memories as to whether you saw that before or not? Stated 27th of August 2002. Yeah. Fair enough. Now, given that you hadn't seen the client brief before, on what basis were you informed about what the TMO wanted the potential lift consultants to do for them?
That would only have been derived from the project brief meeting that took place in, I believe, March 2003?
Were you given anything in writing at the time, can you remember?
No.
And so it's solely on the basis of verbal instructions?
Yes. As I say, until recently, I'd not seen that brief. I've seen it now. I've seen it in recent weeks, but I didn't see it at the time.
Given that this was a major project, was it unusual in your experience for there not to be a written document from the client setting out its instructions and expectations?
I would say that's true.
So it was unusual?
No, sorry. I mean, it would be usual
For
that to be presented to the tendering consultant.
Now, notwithstanding what you've said, could we go back to page 12 in this document? And we see there, paragraph 1.1, TMO and the Lancaster West Estate Management Board require a condition and feasibility report on the 2 traction passenger lifts serving Grenfell Tower and the single hydraulic passenger lift serving the adjacent offices. Now, bearing in mind that you haven't seen this before, can you remember whether the feasibility report was intended to address matters such as cost, length of project and the building design?
Yes, they were.
And so you were aware of the request for a feasibility report?
Yes, indeed.
Now, the next sentence of the first of that section says this: the report shall address the client's concerns in respect to the immediate and medium-term maintenance viability of the existing installations, given the current levels of failures, availability of replacement parts, compliance to latest British standards, and energy conservation. Now, looking at the last element of that quotation, which concerns compliance with British standards, did you discuss with the TMO which particular British standards were likely to apply to the project?
I can't recall, to be absolutely honest, whether that particular bit was discussed.
Looking at it more broadly, was it your normal practice to advise clients on what the relevant regulatory requirements were when considering works to existing lifts?
Yes.
So is it fair for the panel to assume that it's likely that you would have discussed with the TMO the applicable standards with them at some time?
Yes, it would be.
With whom would you have discussed the applicable standards?
Davis Steppel principally, and John Rogers as the project manager for the TMO.
Can you remember when you first discussed the applicable standards with Mr. Steppel?
I'm afraid I can't. It was possibly before or after the first project brief meeting. I can't really remember.
But relatively early stages.
Very early stages, yes.
Now, what were the conclusions of the discussions you had in relation to the measures that would be required to comply with applicable standards?
The discussions around firefighting lifts resulted in the, if you like, instruction, as you called it earlier, that we would not be upgrading to or attempting to upgrade to firefighting standards, but would repeat what was there, which was the fireman's lift with control.
Now, bearing that in mind, can we go to page 15 within this document? It's paragraph 4.10. It's entitled Standards. It's there, we see on the page. And it says this: A, the installation shall comply with BS EN 8.1. 8's been inserted in manuscript 1998, which is Safety Rules for the Construction and Installation of Lifts, Part 1. Electric Lifts, the Health and Safety Statutory Instrument number 831, the Lift Regulations, and Electromagnetic Compatibility and IEE Regulations. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, yes.
And then goes on to say B, however, given the dimensional constraints associated with an existing building, the report shall identify any area where the new installation cannot meet current recommendations or legislation and make recommendations to reduce any potential risks. Now, would you agree that the brief expressly required the consultant to identify where the new installation could not meet current recommendations or legislation and make recommendations to reduce any potential risks?
Yeah.
Now, bearing in mind your evidence that you say you have not seen that, was that nonetheless an instruction that was conveyed to you verbally?
I can't recall, to be absolutely honest, on that particular issue.
Can you remember whether you produced any document or gave any form of briefing, verbal or otherwise, setting out the extent to which the new installation may not meet applicable standards and what could be done to mitigate any risks arising?
I can't remember doing so, but the scheme did involve the mitigation of such shortcomings as over travel and pit depth, because we were increasing speed.
Looked at differently, was it your normal practice when dealing with work to lifts in existing buildings, would it have been your standard practice to have advised the client of the relevant standards and the extent to which works may not meet the relevant standards?
I would say so, yes.
And did you do that at this project?
I can't recall, to be absolutely honest.
Now, given the height of Grenfell Tower, together with existing physical building constraints, the report, I'm looking at subparagraph C now, the report shall address the issues of firefighting and evacuation lift requirements and how they affect the proposed works. Now, looking at subparagraph C, would you agree that that is crystal clear, that the brief required the consultant's feasibility report to address the issue of firefighting and evacuation lift requirements and how they affected the proposed works?
Yes, I see that was the instruction on the brief for the feasibility study. But as I said, the discussions with John Rogers and David Steppel the outcome was that we wouldn't even be reporting on that, and evidenced by the feasibility study does not research it, does not go to it.
And because of that instruction. And because of that instruction,
yeah.
Mr. Staff. Now, can we look at the tender process? And in terms of that process, if we can go to your first statement, which is at BUT, quadruple 0, 0040 /2, and at paragraph A6, you say there you weren't involved in the tender process. Do you have any knowledge or recollection as to how Butler and Young came to be involved with the project at Grenfell?
By invitation by Janet Rhymes, I believe, to tender for the consultancy services.
Who was Janet Rhymes?
She was the...
Do you mean Janice Ray?
No, Janet Rhymes was the... she was the consultant in a way. She appointed consultants for the TMO. That was her particular role.
But you've got no direct knowledge that you can assist the panel with?
No, sorry.
Now, looking at the appointment, in relation to your involvement or Butler and Young's involvement in the Tower project, you state at paragraph A2, which is at page 1 of this statement, that as far as I can ascertain, Butler and Young involvement was from early 2003 through to the final account document dated February 2007.
Yes.
And just picking up your reference to Janet Rhymes, if we can go to BUT, quadruple 0, 0005, we have here a letter from Mr. Moorhouse to Miss Rhymes, dated the 7th of April 2003, in which he acknowledged receipt of formal instructions. So it would appear that Butler and Young's involvement at least started in or about April 2003. Would you agree?
Yes, it would. Absolutely, yeah.
Now, if we can now turn to Butler and Young's duties in relation to the project at Grenfell, and if we could go back to BUT quadruple 00040/1 and paragraph A2. Thank you. You see set out there are the 7 elements of Butler and Young's responsibilities as part of the project. I'll give you just a brief opportunity to refresh your memory of that paragraph. Was that set of duties typical or similar to other duties in other contracts between Butler and Young and RBKC and the TMO?
Yes, I would say so.
Now, we have been unable to find any written contract between Butler and Young and RBKC or the TMO. Do you remember whether there was, in fact, any written agreement entered into between the parties?
I don't. I did that letter that you just highlighted not demonstrate that? I don't know.
If we can go back to it, first of all, can you remember seeing any written agreement between the parties?
No, sir, I can't.
And if we just go back, just so because you raised it, if we can go back to BUT quadruple 00005. All that is a confirmation of instructions. But can you remember ever seeing as a written contract as such?
No, I can't.
Can you remember ever seeing Butler and Young contracting on standard terms? Can you remember ever seeing a standard terms document produced by Butler and Young at all?
I can't recall, to be honest.
There's some reference in the documents to an entity called Brodie Plant Goddard. What was their role in the project?
They were appointed as proxy project manager. I can't say that. Proxy project managers by John Rogers. John Rogers sort of retreated from project management of the project at about the time the site work started, and Brodie Plant Goddard were appointed as project managers on the KCTMO's behalf. And
if we go back to your first statement, so it's BUT quadruple 00040/1, thank you. Effectively, their involvement did not change, alter or qualify the obligations set out there.
No.
Thank you. Now, if we can now look at your own individual duties and responsibilities as part of this project, you deal with this in your second statement, which can be found at BUT quadruple 00055/4. And we see there in the second sentence of paragraph 5 that you took over day-to-day administration of the project from November 2004 until its conclusion, presumably in April 2007. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we can go back to your first statement, which is at BUT quadruple 00040/2 and paragraph A3. There again, you set out the 7 elements of your responsibilities at Grenfell. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Now, could I now turn to a discussion of the scope of the proposed works and discussions with the TMO on that subject? We've looked at briefly the project brief produced by the TMO in August 2002, which you hadn't seen until recently. Can we assume, therefore, that that brief did not form the basis of your discussions with the TMO as to scope of the works?
So I don't think I understand the question quite there.
If you hadn't seen that project brief,
Right.
am I right in assuming it didn't form the basis of your discussions with the TMO as to the proposed scope of the works?
My discussions, I don't know if Mr. Moorhouse saw that brief.
But I'm just concerned with what you can speak to.
I can't say that. Yes, I can only say that that brief did not form part of a basis for my discussions.
And so the basis of your discussions were verbal conversations, inevitably, with Mr. Steppel and Mr. Rogers to a lesser extent?
Yes.
And were Brodie, Plant, Goddard involved in any discussions involving the scope of the works?
No, sir. They didn't appear till, I'd say, just about site start, just before site start. I think that the pre-start site meeting in November 2004 was attended by Brodie, Plant, Goddard. That was the first I believe that's the first meeting they attended.
Now, can you now remember when you had your substantive discussions with Mr. Steppel as to whether firefighting lifts should be installed at the tower or not?
I believe those discussions took place after, during, or before the project brief meeting in, was that March 2003? I can't recall the exact date. But
So
it would have been
in broad
around that
terms, the
time.
first half of 2003.
Yes, certainly.
Now, if we can go to your first statement, which conveniently is on the screen, turn to page 4, and paragraph A12.c, which is at the bottom of the page, you say this. My understanding is that it was considered at that time that due to structural and environmental constraints, complete compliance with BS 5588 would only be fully achieved by the installation of completely new lifts in new buildings. I believe these matters were discussed and agreed with KCTMO at an early stage. And it's those discussions that you're referring to here are those you're referring to.
Yes,
now.
indeed.
How detailed were the discussions you had with Mr. Steppel regarding compliance with the firefighting lift requirements?
I can't really recall how detailed they became. I can only really recall the outcome of those discussions, which, as I say, prevented us from addressing the Section C issue in the feasibility study that was produced.
Now, just following on from this, can we go to a particular document, which is a minute of a meeting that took place on the 8th of May 2003? And the minute can be found at BUT quadruple 000010. We see their lift refurbishment project briefing meeting at Town Hall, Kensington Town Hall, on Thursday the 8th of May. We can see that you are present. You're last in the list of attendees. Mr. Moorhouse was there, Mr. Steppel was there, and Mr. Rogers was there as well. Now, first of all, do you remember this meeting?
Only by looking at it now.
Can you help the panel? Was this the first meeting between Butler and Young and the client?
I have a feeling it was no, it might have been the first one, actually. Yes, it might have been the first. It's a project briefing meeting, therefore, yes, it would be the first one. There was another one in July, I believe.
And so earlier on, when you thought the meeting may have been in March 2003, refreshing your memory, looking at this, it's more likely to be in May.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yeah.
Now, if we can just scroll down the minute, but staying on this page, and it's section 2.0 deals with project objectives and scope of works. And if we look at paragraph 2.2, it says this, and I quote, "The feasibility study would address the full requirements of the brief and the following issues in particular. Future serviceability of the lift for a minimum of 20 years, minimum disruption to the residents of paramount importance, compliance with current standards, energy efficiency and facilities for persons with a wide range of disabilities, for possibility of enhancing car dimensions and lift speed." Now, looking at that minute, which refers to the full requirements of the brief, you're adamant, are you, that you had not seen the brief, the written brief at any stage, and certainly not at this meeting?
No, certainly I hadn't.
But would you accept that compliance with current standards was a requirement set out clearly in this meeting as recorded in the minute?
Yes, I would.
Now, the minutes do not document or record any discussion of what standards applied, and the extent to which they could be complied with. Do you remember any such discussion at this meeting?
I don't. I remember discussions, but I can't remember whether that was at this meeting.
Now, Mr. Moorhouse, in his second statement, and we don't need to go to it, refers to a meeting with David Stepple and John Rogers, and he doesn't refer to you, in which he stated that so Mr. Moorhouse, raised the issue of firefighting lifts at the meeting and was told that consideration of firefighting lifts was not to be part of the feasibility study. Now, did that conversation take place at this meeting, or, to the best of your knowledge, was there a later meeting only attended by Moorhouse, Stepple and Rogers?
That could have been the case, certainly.
But can you help the panel one way?
I can't recall whether that was after this meeting, before this meeting, or on another date. I really can't recall that.
But you're clear that at an early stage of the project, Mr. Stepple gave you an instruction that firefighting lifts were not to be considered.
Gave Ian Moorhouse an instruction. Yeah.
Now, if that instruction were given at this meeting, that is something which common sense and commercial prudence suggests should have been recorded in the minutes. Would you accept that?
If it was at that meeting.
And would you take it from me that there's no record of any such instruction in this minute?
Yes, I can.
Can you remember ever being briefed by Mr. Moorhouse that Mr. Stepple had given the instruction that firefighting lifts were not to be provided?
Yes, I can.
And can you remember, first of all, when he gave you that instruction?
I can't. I'm sorry, I can't.
Is that something that back in 2003 would have been written down either in the form of a file note or in a letter or anything like that? What would Butler & Young do?
Certainly a file note would have been made, I would have thought.
And that would have been standard practice?
Yes, it would.
Did you ever raise yourself at this meeting or thereafter whether installation of a firefighting lift should be considered or should have been considered by the TMO?
I didn't personally know.
Do you know of anyone else who did?
Imagine to have the resultant discussion and instruction and outcome that Ian Moorhouse and David Stepple had, that they must have discussed that. But I'm speculating, really.
Now, we can go to if needs be, but in your first statement, we asked you about, in response to a question asking about any communications, verbal or written, regarding the installation of a firefighting lift. You said, the reference is at A12E, I am unable to recall any such communications. Now, can you help the panel as to why you can now remember an instruction given by Mr. Stepple when you were asked specifically about this point by the inquiry?
Well, I referred in the earlier answer in that witness statement to the discussions at an early stage. When I was answering that question in the sense that I could not remember any discussion with any of those parties where it was proposed that the lifts be upgraded to firefighting status. That was what I meant by the answer. Perhaps I answered the wrong question, but that's what I meant by the answer.
Now, if we could turn to Mr. Howkins' report, and if we can go to RHO quadruple 0 0003 /121 and paragraph 259. And Mr. Howkins here is reviewing these initial discussions, and what he says is, as part of these discussions around the achievement of the goals in the brief, I would have expected Butler & Young to have drawn TMO's attention to the relevant British standards for firefighting lifts, their applicability and the feasibility of achieving compliance with the standards. This includes advising TMO that tall buildings should have a firefighting lift. What would be your response to Mr. Howkins' statement of opinion there?
My only answer that I can give to that is that Ian Moorhouse must have discussed those very requirements for David Steppel to have said what he said.
But that is essentially speculation.
That is speculation.
But so is it fair to assume, therefore, you cannot help us as to whether a representative of Butler and Young raised these matters? Certainly you did not.
Certainly I did not.
Thank you. Now, you stated that, and it's at paragraph A12C of your first witness statement, you stated that structural constraints were said to be a barrier to full compliance with firefighting lift requirements. Can you help us? What did you mean? What did you have in mind when you referred to structural constraints?
Probably the trying to achieve the two methods of water dispersal from the landings or from the pit. I imagine they would cause considerable difficulties in trying to achieve.
Did you seek or receive advice from a structural engineer about the nature and extent of any relevant structural constraints?
No.
Did you ever advise the TMO to seek the specialist advice of a structural engineer?
No, sir.
Were any of the conversations between yourselves or any relevant structural engineers and the TMO documented?
No, sir.
Could we go to APX, quadruple 5424? And this is a letter from you to John Rogers, who, as you said, is the project manager on Project One. And he notes, or rather you note, under the heading Structural Engineer's Duties, so it's the first substantive paragraph, you say this: you're aware that during the course of the feasibility study, it was evident that RBKC had no drawings or structural details of either the duplex lifts or the hydraulic lift, and you did in fact issue a variation against the study for structural engineers' duties in the sum of £1,300. My email of 16th of June 2003 refers. Since the feasibility study, the structural engineer has obviously been involved in determining the specification requirements, calculations, and details for both projects. All contractors' drawings are now approved, and you go on. Now, bearing that in mind, if we could turn to an email which can be found at TMO 00853865. Now, if that could be expanded, this is an email from Mr. Moorhouse, and it refers to, in the fourth paragraph down, to needing structural advice to investigate the option of increasing lift car size and possibly increasing speed. Now, looking at those two documents together, your letter and Mr. Moorhouse's email, both suggest that structural advice was sought from engineer, and that it was focused on the specific issue of increased lift car size.
Yes,
is that right?
Yes, it was.
Is it therefore, given your previous evidence, it's safe to assume that the structural engineer's advice was not sought as to the feasibility of installing a firefighting lift, or at least such features of a firefighting lift that were reasonably practicable?
That's correct.
Now, you also stated that environmental constraints were said to be a barrier to full compliance with the standard. Again, can you help the panel? What did you mean by environmental constraints in this context?
Probably smoke dispersal, lobby pressurisation, that sort of issue.
Now, you stated that complete compliance with BS 558 would only be fully achieved by the installation of completely new lifts and new buildings. Now, do you mean that at the time, the considered view was that complete compliance with BS 558 was effectively impossible or not reasonably practicable?
Not reasonably practical, I would say.
But it was possible?
It may have been possible. Without doing a feasibility, I wouldn't know.
Is it fair to say that neither structural nor structural constraints would have prevented partial compliance with firefighting lift standards?
That's true to say, yes.
Well, that might depend on what parts are going to comply with, mightn't it?
Well, it might, yes. It
I
depends
mean,
what.
you could put in a hatch in the top of the lift car, regardless of any structural constraints, I imagine.
Yes, there would be, but that was, in fact, another caveat for the practicality of local authority housing. They were very, very nervous about.
Oh yes, but I mean, perhaps I was really picking up Mr. Kinnear because to ask whether you can implement some of the requirements depends on which ones you're talking about.
Yes, indeed.
Well, let's probably, it was a run-up to the next question, which involved costing. And Mr. Kalan, who was obviously from the TMO, stated in the fifth line of paragraph 40 of his statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is TMO 00866023/5. Now, he estimated the cost of upgrading each lift to full firefighting standard to be £10,000 per lift. Now, from the pure perspective of cost, would you agree with that estimate?
No.
What would be your estimate of upgrading each of these lifts to full firefighting specification at Grenfell in 2003-4?
I would estimate from what I wrote in my second witness statement that would be somewhere between 70 and 100,000. I would imagine that the 20,000 that Robin was referring to would unlikely to cover much more than the alternative main supply.
And just for clarity, when you refer to 70 to 100,000, is that the cost of upgrading all lifts or each individual lift?
That's for 2 lifts.
For 2 lifts. Thank you. Now, can we turn to the feasibility study itself, which may well be...
Slightly new topic?
We are, and I was about to ask, given that I realised it was a new topic, whether that might be an appropriate juncture for a break, sir.
Well, I think it would, yes. Thank you very much. Well, I think we warned you, Mr. Ellis, we have a break during the morning, and this looks as though it's a convenient time to have it.
Yes, sir.
So we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And I have to ask you, please, not to discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone while you're out of the room. Okay. All right? Thank you very much. Now, would you like to go to the usher? She'll look after you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. 25 to 12.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, would you ask Mr. Ellis to come back in, please? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Mr. Ellis, you ready to carry on?
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kelly.
Thanks, sir. Could we turn to the feasibility study, Mr. Ellis? And it can be found at BUT 00002. Excuse me. There we go. We see the date in the bottom left-hand corner, July 2003. So 2 months after the first project meeting at Kensington Town Hall. Have you seen this document before?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And did you draft it or contribute to the drafting?
I cannot recall.
Did you read the feasibility study at the time, i.e. summer 2003?
Yes, I did.
If we go to page 5, and we see at paragraph 1.2, it says the principal areas covered by the study are, and they're identified, but looking at number 2 says this: compliance with current health and safety at work requirements, the recommendations of British standards, and EN 81/1. And then if we could stay in this document but go to page 12 and section 3.10, we see there scope is reiterated, and it states this report has been principally concerned with establishing the relative merits of each of the 3 options with the following particular considerations: compliance with the Health and Safety at Work Act and BS 7255, safe working on lifts; 2, compliance with the requirements of relevant British standards and EN 81/1 where appropriate. Would you agree, or at least take it from me, that there's no reference excuse me, in section 3.10 to BS 5588-5?
There is none, no, that's correct.
And equally, there's no reference there to BS EN 81/72/2003.
Also correct.
Would you consider those to be significant omissions, or in your view, do they reflect the instructions given by Mr. Steppel to your Mr. Moorhouse?
They reflect those instructions exactly, even to the option appraisal, which in a one-liner mentions fireman's control.
There is no, you can take it from me, there is no reference in the feasibility report to an instruction from Mr. Steppel that firefighting lifts were not to be considered. First of all, do you find that omission surprising, given the clarity of the instruction that's said to have been provided?
No, I think what would have happened had the instructions still been in place to complete the feasibility study of upgrading, I'm pretty sure that they would have thrown it back at us, that we would have had that report rejected for not dealing with that aspect.
And just flowing from that answer, and just to give you the opportunity to answer a criticism that's made of Butler and Young by Mr. Howkins, could we go to his report, which is at RHO 000/3/122 and paragraph 261. Now it says there, if we could amplify that paragraph, 261. The report shouldn't, he's talking about the feasibility report here, should have included an analysis of whether it was reasonably practicable to bring the lifts up to full firefighting lift standard, and if not, why not? As part of this analysis, I would have expected Butler and Young to have provided TMO with 1, the cost of bringing the lifts up to full firefighting lift standard; 2, a warning of any potential structural, electrical or plumbing constraints, and relevant specialists from whom further advice may need to be sought, e.g. a structural engineer; 3, to highlight the potential risks arising from not installing firefighting lifts. Overall, I would have expected to see in the report an option of bringing the lifts up to full firefighting standard alongside other options and the benefits, disadvantages of each, including considerations such as cost, length of programme works, need to count residents, etc. What would be your response to that statement of opinion?
Just in the same way that the previous answer, the study which we may have carried out on those aspects that he highlights there were discounted before we even started the feasibility study.
Thank you. Could we go to BUT 0000006? Now, these are meetings of a lift refurbishment meeting held on the 9th of July. The month, unfortunately, is missing there on the title page, which you attended. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
And that that two-page minute contains no reference to any firefighting lift standards. Would you agree?
As far as I can remember, it does not.
Now, if we can go to TMO 00869-720/109. Thank you. And if that could be expanded. Now, this is a memorandum, 16th of December 2003, sent by John Rogers to Paul McAnish. Who was Paul McAnish? Do you know?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Now, if we look at the third paragraph there, you may not have seen this before, but Mr. Rogers sets out there two options in the third paragraph for lift refurbishment. The first is noted to be like-for-like replacement. The second is referred to as an install larger, faster lifts and increase the car entrance width. This would not provide a lift service to current standards, but would improve reliability and significantly reduce waiting times. The memo then goes on to refer to a feasibility report from the lift consultant, and options 1 and 3B set out in the feasibility report. The memo suggests that John Rogers was aware that neither lift refurbishment would bring the lift service up to current standards. Had you been involved in any advice to Mr. Rogers that lift works would not bring the lift service up to current standards?
I can't recall whether I did or not. He's either referring to the fact that the current standard of 5588 would not be met, or he's referring to the fact that possibly the over travels and pit depths would be not to British standard because of the increased speed. I'm not sure what he meant by that in that context.
Thank you. Could we now turn to the specification itself, and could we turn to BUT quadruple 000044? Now, so you can orientate yourself in time, you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner the date of the specification is April 2004. Can you remember now who wrote that specification?
I believe Ian Moorhouse drafted the specification, but I believe I also had a part in it.
Was it reviewing it, or were you involved in some technical contribution?
I think I was involved. I seem to remember being involved towards the end when a collection of information from architect Mike Flynn and the structural engineer Jim Bryce was being brought in to review.
If we can turn to page 20 within this document, and we see there paragraph 2A.01, and if we look at the fifth paragraph, which starts with the words "should anything," if that could be amplified, it says, "Should anything be omitted from the specification, which is fitting and usually considered necessary for due and proper completion of the work, the tenderer shall verbally bring this to the attention of the SO prior to tender submission, with confirmation and letter prior to submitting the tender return." Can you help us? What do the initials SO indicate? Is it supervising officer?
Supervising officer.
And were you the supervising officer?
Well, Ian Moorhouse was the supervising officer in general terms, but I became the supervising officer.
And insofar as you can remember, the TMO never wrote to you saying, why aren't you advising us about firefighting lifts?
No.
Did any tenderers bring the absence of firefighting lift features in the specification to your attention?
No, sir.
No.
Not that I can remember.
To the best of your knowledge, can you remember any Mr. Moorhouse saying that tenderers had raised the question of firefighting lifts?
I can't recall any such.
Could I ask you to stay in this document, but go to page 22? And it's really towards the bottom of the page at paragraph 2A.05, which is under the heading Regulations. And it says there, it shall be understood that the equipment specified and that the characteristics of the site, particularly dimensions and clearances, may not fully comply with current British and European standards, and these shall be qualified by the tenderer in the tender return. For those purposes, would the reference to British and European standards have included those concerned with firefighting lifts?
No, not necessarily, I believe. That was referring to what I spoke about earlier, was the dimensions and clearances, largely because of the increased speed.
Looking at the next paragraph in this section, it says, although it is recognised that the existing structural constraint shall prevent full compliance with harmonised European standards, the requirement is for the lift installation to include all of those items and features that do comply as far as is reasonably practicable. Now, would you accept that the specification required the lift installation to comply as far as was reasonably practicable with harmonised European standards?
Yes, I would.
And your evidence is that standards concerning firefighting lifts were excluded from the reference to harmonised European standards?
Yes, indeed.
Although that's not mentioned here, is it?
No.
Now, this part of paragraph 2A.05 refers to, quotes, existing structural constraints, close quotes, preventing full compliance with standards. Were the structural constraints contemplated there any different to the structural constraints you discussed earlier in your evidence?
In terms of, sorry, I don't quite understand that.
Well, put more simply, what are you talking about when you're talking about existing structural constraints here? Principally, they're talking about the over travel at the top of the shaft, the stopping distances and the pit depths. Now, if we can turn over the page to page 23, we come to 2A.06, which concerned design standards. You'll see halfway down the page. And that section says this: the equipment and installation shall conform to this specification and to the relevant British standards, including codes of practice, and in particular BS 5655, BS 7255, and EN 81-1. Where this specification differs from those standards and codes, the provision of this specification shall prevail. It goes on to say, reference to British standards and codes of practice shall mean the addition current 3 months prior to the date for return of tenders. A certificate of compliance with the relevant British standards shall be provided to the supervising officer on request. And then it goes on to say, it shall be understood that the existing characteristics, particularly dimensions and clearances, may not comply with current British standards, and these shall be qualified in the tender return. Can you remember now, was a certificate of compliance with relevant British standards ever provided to the supervising officer?
Not that I can recall.
Would you necessarily have seen that, or would it have been something really for Mr. Moorhouse rather than you?
I really can't say. I didn't see that. I can't remember seeing such a document.
Could we turn over the page to page 24? Now we see here in paragraph 2A.04 related documentation and references, and it says this tender documentation shall be read in conjunction with, and its requirements are in addition to, the general conditions of contract and any drawings and other documents issued with it and listed in this invitation to tender and as set out below. Now, what's set out below in somewhat torrential form is a series of British standards and indeed references to various bodies such as the London Fire Brigade. Would you accept that by 2004 some of the legislation in this list had in fact been repealed? For example, the Factories Act 1961.
Yes, I would.
Could we look at, if we can go to the bottom of the page and the fourth entry up from the bottom. Now there's a reference there to 5588, Fire Precautions and Design, Construction and Use of Building. It doesn't specify which part and which year the addition of that standard that's been referred to. Would you accept, therefore, that the reference to BS 5588 is unclear in that respect?
It is unclear, albeit the only component or element of the specification that would need to comply with 5588 would be the control, which was specified in 2A70, I think.
Yeah.
And that does as far as I'm aware, comply with 5588 because the embedded software that the contractor provides in his control panel will be suitable for firefighting lifts, and therefore that's why we changed our clause to reflect that the fact that the control that was being provided was compliant with 5588.
I suppose the issue that immediately rises out of that answer is that that narrow reading is not reflected here, is it, in the reference, in the broad reference to BS 5588?
No, to be fair.
And so, absent any qualification, the broad reference to BS 5588 implies that firefighting lift standards should have been considered. Would you accept that?
No, I don't think so. Only in what was actually specified in the. As you say, that the specification takes preference, and the specification defined it. So it was only referring to having to comply with that standard as far as the clause that was relevant was concerned. That doesn't sound too silly.
Would you accept that there's no reference there to European Standard BS EN 8172/2003?
No, there's not.
Was that specifically considered and rejected, or did you not consider it because of the instruction given by Mr. Steppel?
That would be true, yes.
Which one of those options?
The second one.
Can you explain to the panel the purpose in simply identifying bodies such as the London Fire Brigade, the London Electricity Board?
The idea of the list of standards was that it was all-encompassing, and whatever elements in the specification, unless directed otherwise, would comply with those standards.
But simply referring to, say, the London Fire Brigade and London Electricity Board isn't really a direction towards standards, is it?
No.
You're really simply identifying two separate bodies. So what purpose was served by identifying those two entities, for example?
I think the idea of putting particularly the fire brigade in, that the contractor would need to have some discourse with the fire brigade about what they were doing. Similarly with the electricity board, if they were, depending on what they were doing with the main suppliers, there may be a requirement to actually get certain things verified in terms of electrical supply.
Would it be fair to say that the list of statutes, regulations, codes of practice, etc., it has the feel of being cut and paste from previous specifications? Would that be a fair or an unfair observation?
No, that would be a fair observation, I'd say.
So it wasn't drafted specifically with Grenfell in mind?
No. In the main.
Do you remember any specific discussions with the TMO regarding the substance of the specification?
I can't recall. I mean, there were exchanges with Robin Callan about the specification.
And were those detailed exchanges?
Yes, he wrote a couple of, I can't remember what it was. He did write a couple of comments. I can't remember what they were now.
And is it fair to say that he did not raise the question of firefighting lifts?
No, he did not.
Can you remember discussing the specification with Janice Ray?
No, I cannot.
Just see whether the email jogs your memory. TMO 00853 777. There we go, just in it's her email, the top half of that page, 13th of May 2004. I recognise I'm asking you about events 15 years ago. It's just looking at that email. Can you remember, was that the sum total of your discussions with Janice Ray regarding the specification for the lift works?
Yes, I must admit, I even now can't remember that. But,
Don't worry. If you're not able to assist us any further, Mr. Ellis, don't worry. Could we now turn to the specific features of a firefighting lift? And it really flows from the chairman's intervention before the morning break and looking at each element of the firefighting lift. Now, in your second statement to the inquiry, you comment, and we don't need to go to it, but it's at paragraph 12 in the 6th bullet point there, and can be found at BUT *000055/5. You say this, that local authorities were generally concerned about trapdoors in lifts in terms of safety and security of the building. This was particularly relevant to BS 5588-5, which required that a trapdoor be opened from within the lift, creating a potentially hazardous situation in terms of misuse. Did you have cause to advise the TMO that trapdoors were a safety feature and were therefore important?
having, again, harking back to the original discussions that Ian had with David Steppel and John Rogers, the detail was then missing from the feasibility study, the specification and everything else that followed. So whether we would have said anything, I can't remember, but I doubt it, whether we said anything about the trap door in the roof.
Now, one thing that Mr. Howkins says, and we don't need to go to it, but the reference is paragraph 303 of his report at RHO *0003/136. He said that the provision of an emergency trapdoor would have been straightforward and at little additional cost at the point when the lift cars were replaced with larger versions in Project 1. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that would have been a simple task to include or incorporate a trapdoor into that. But as we see from even more recent statements from Janice Ray and others, that they still don't approve of having trapdoors in their lifts. And that I would fairly guesstimate that was true of pretty much all the local authorities, certainly in London, that they are considered more of a hazard than they are a safety requirement.
And when Mr. Howkins refers to at little additional cost, I know it's difficult given 15 odd years apart, if not more. Can you give the panel a rough and ready idea of the cost of installing a trapdoor in one lift? Would have been at the time?
I doubt it would have been. I doubt if it would have been 1,000 per lift.
In a very approximate.
Yeah, very approximately. It might have been £1,000 a lift. The EN 8172 was slightly more onerous in that they start talking, and slightly more hazardous in that they start talking about steps to get up to this trap at the back of the lift car. So it would become even more of a concern to the authorities.
Now, water protection is another feature of a firefighting lift. What would have been the advantages and the disadvantages of providing water protection in these lifts at Grenfell in 2003-4?
The protecting of car top electrical equipment and such like by protection of ramps and tins, stuff like that, would have been relatively simple and not huge cost again, probably £500, I don't know a lift.
£500 per lift?
Yeah, but that's the primary or secondary, whichever you like to call it, means. There has to be another means of deflecting water. It is either pit sumps or landing drainage or whatever.
So water protection of itself was a feasible measure that could have been incorporated?
One element was, possibly.
Now, secondary power supply is another feature of a firefighting lift. What would have been, was it feasible to provide a secondary power supply?
I don't know, to be honest. But I certainly don't know what it would have cost, but I imagine it would have been considerable.
Can we go back just for a moment to the water protection?
Yeah.
What I had understood you to be suggesting is you can provide some sort of cover, if you like, over the top of the lift to protect the lift car from water flowing from above. Is that right?
Yes, there are IPO3 protection, as they call it, or APA 54
Right.
protection to car and landing electrical components. One method of protecting, but there have to be. My understanding was there have to be two different.
Well, you then went on to mention something about a sump, and it led me to, and you seem to be a little more doubtful as to whether you could provide that aspect of protection, which made me wonder what happens if you have the protection over the lift, the water's got to go somewhere.
Yes, yeah.
So can you just explain where does the water go and what steps do you have to take to deal with it?
That the water glancing on water pouring, if water were to pour down the lift shaft, it would end up in the pit, having maybe deflected from some of the equipment on top by these other protection we just talked about. But that's where they would end up in the pit.
And then you have to provide for that to be drained away?
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
And is that a difficult thing to do?
It's difficult to say how difficult it might be. I think it's difficult to say what other landing action you would take to deflect water.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much.
Was it feasible to have installed a fire service communication system?
Yes.
And can you give the panel an idea of how costly it would have been to have done so?
Not a huge amount, I'd say. Maybe maybe £2,000 a lift.
Fire resistance landing doors. How feasible were they to have installed?
They were there. The landing doors were 2-hour fire assessed, as I remember.
That's useful. One of the things, the reason I asked the question was the specification itself, and we can go to it if that helps. If we go to BUT 0000044/55 and look at section 28.61, this may well be my lay eye not picking up a point, Mr. Ellis, so I apologise in advance if I'm missing something. And we see at the bottom of the page there, the specification starts for current landing doors, and it goes over the page. There are some 16 individual features that are identified, none of which is prescribing that the doors be of a certain fire-resistant quality and for how long. Now, was that something that was an assumption, or that such doors would be provided so that it doesn't need setting out, or...?
It was probably my, if you like, concerns over how we would achieve the fire assessment. Fire-rated doors or fire-rated entrances, which were provided by Propbrook with a small frame 50mm trim, to obtain the natural fire certification of that door, you would have to butt the full-depth architraves against these small frame trims, which is something that we didn't want to do because we considered it a pinch point or an attack point, as well as being possibly not so aesthetically pleasing. So the full depth architraves were wrapped round the small frame trims of the fire rated entrance, and then we required to get a letter of assessment from Warrington Fire, which I remember chasing Apex for and eventually finding. They sent me a copy, or gave me a copy, I can't remember which. But that was if you like, the development that we did with the successful contractor.
And so, although it's not mentioned in the specification, it's something that was installed because of concerns you entertained about fire resistance.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I now turn on to the question of the fire control switch itself? And if we can stay in this document, the specification, but go on to page 60, and clause 2A.70. Now, this deals with, as you can see, fireman's control, it's set out there. Now, am I right that the switch was to be installed on the ground floor of the tower?
Yes.
And can you explain, for the panel and those listening how one fire control switch operated 2 lifts?
Well, yes, okay. What happens if, this is from best of my memory, when you operate the key, 2 things happen. First, both lifts return to the fire service access level, and the indicators then start to reflect the fact that the lifts are under fire control. So the indicators will scroll, lift under fire control, interspersed with the floor nomenclature. Once you get the lifts down, they are on the fire surface access level, which is the ground floor in this case. The firefighter can take control of a lift, either lift. They're shared shafts, so it's moot that they should both operate. They can then operate the lift as a fireman's lift. In fact, it is, as I said, that is actually more or less, well, it is. It's firefighting control. That is the control that is 5588 compliant. The idea being that if the other lift is the only one that turns up because the other one is malfunctioned, then you could use that one. Once the firemen have taken one away, the other one will remain inactive. But until you get one down at the ground floor, then either could be the fireman's lift.
Now, just following on from that, can you help us as to what difference, if any, there is between, on the one hand, the fireman's control switch as defined in this specification, and on the other hand, the fire control switch, which is described in the relevant standards?
Yes, the fireman's control switch was operated by the TMO and other local authority standards, which was the express drop key.
And following on from that express drop key, am I right in understanding that a fire control switch is operated with a Euro key, which has a triangular design?
That's what the standard calls for. That's the British or the EN standard. The problem is with a triangle key is that it's too easily obtainable, or it's very, very available to any miscreant that wants to mess about with the lift. And also the miscreants' number one weapon, well, not number one weapon, but one of their weapons is the famous tube of super glue. And it has been known for those to be, the sockets of the triangle key to be smeared with super glue and jammed solid, which you couldn't do with the drop key very easily.
One of the bit of evidence that came out in phase 1 was that one of the firefighters who attended the fire said that he'd ordered his own express key directly from eBay, and he'd done that about 3 times in his career. Was there any real difference, therefore, between the competing availability of the 2 different types of keys that could be used to operate a fireman's control switch?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure of the question there. Are you asking if there's a...
Well, they both seem to be as readily available as the other, is my point.
Yeah, the genuine express drop keys should be purchased normally from a company, or were purchased normally from a company called LCL, which was the express lifts parts company, if you like.
Yeah.
It was the spares company. Only when I read the report of Roger Howkins did I realise that people were buying them from eBay, and they could possibly have been of an incorrect dimension, but
that's not something about which you were aware in 2004.
Certainly not.
Could we now turn to a separate topic, which is the automatic fire recall system? Now, when I'm using this phrase, what I'm referring to is a system which, when a fire is detected, would automatically recall the lifts to a particular floor. Now, first of all, is that a fair and accurate definition to apply for our discussion?
Yes, it is.
Now, before the lift works, do you know if there was an automatic fire recall system in place at Grenfell?
I do not know. I don't believe so.
Now, the specification doesn't make any provision for an automatic fire recall system. Do you remember whether there were any discussions about whether to have one or not?
Not before the contract started. It was raised at one of the periodic site meetings I had, the monthly site meetings I had.
Now, following on from that answer, if we can go to an email which can be found at TMO 00863276/2. And we see there on the bottom of the page, the initial email is one from Janice Ray, 13th of July 2005, sent at 11:33. And she suggests that you were asked if an automatic fire recall system was installed as part of the lift works. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yes.
When it was raised after some way into the contract. Now, do you remember this particular exchange?
Hazily,
Now,
yes.
if we scroll up, we have your response, which is immediately above her email, sent at the 13th, the same day, and sent at the 14:25 in the afternoon. And you say that no such system was installed, and you suggest that if a system were required, you may be able to install it. Now, I won't take you through all of them, but if you want to refresh your memory, the next three emails in the chain going forward, there's some discussion about the costs, followed by a final email, which we find at the top of page 1, if we can go to. That's from Janice Ray on the 13th of September 2005, so 2 months or so after, well, exactly 2 months after the first email, confirming that the costs have been agreed and the system is to be installed. Was that the sum total of the exchange that you remember regarding installation of the automatic fire recall system?
I think there were some other emails that came later confirming it had been tested. I instructed by a variation order expressed to Apex to provide a box and set of volt-free contacts on the wall of the lift machine room for the fire alarm contractor to connect to. As I said in the earlier email, all the modern control panels have that embedded in their software, just like the fireman's control or firefighting control protocol.
Thank you. And can you remember what type of automatic fire recall system was installed?
No, I can't. It was it was actually completed by the fire alarm contractor after we completed our lift works on site. So I got Apex to provide the provision, if you like, the box with the volt-free contact, but I don't believe the fire alarm contractor connected up till, I don't know, February, March, 2006.
Can you help us as to how the automatic fire recall system interacted, if at all, with the manual fire control switch?
It would, if the automatic fire alarm recall operated, both lifts would do exactly what they would do when you operate the fireman's switch. That is, they would dive to the fire service access level, if that was the selected level, and the doors would open and they would remain inoperative. The lifts would remain inoperative. If the fire officer then operated the fireman's control switch, one of the lifts would become operating for him, would go on to fireman's service. The indicators would scroll that, and he would have a lift available to him.
Can you remember why the system was installed in the first place? What was the TMO's reasoning for asking for it?
I cannot recall, to be absolutely honest. No, I can't recall what. I mean, it's probably quite a sensible thing to do, but I can't recall why. Well, Janice raised it, didn't she? It was Janice that raised it.
Can you help us as to why the system was eventually disconnected?
Oh, that I can't, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Can I now turn to a separate topic, which is the relationship between Apex, Butler and Young? Now, Apex were appointed as the lift contractors, is that right?
Yes, they were.
And we've got email correspondence from January 2004 which suggests that Ian Moorhouse approached Warren Genchner at Apex to inform him about the project and encourage him to tender. Do you know whether that was done frequently or regularly?
I think if I think what happened there is that the TMO raised an object notice of the project, and I think Ian was just making sure that the various contractors that we would like to tender were aware of it.
And had Apex and Butler and Young done a lot of work together in the past?
Certainly some, yeah, some work.
And can I take it that Mr. Moorhouse was keen that Apex bid because, in his view, he could rely upon them?
They were one of several contractors we favoured, we thought would do a good job. I mean, Jackson lifts, Axis elevators, Guideline lifts, Stanner, and others, and Titan lifts, General lifts. There were a number that were, if you like, on our approved, not exactly list, but bunch, if you like.
Had Butler and Young and Apex worked together previously on a high-rise residential building project involving lifts? No. Can I now turn to contracts and the roles and responsibilities? And if we go to APX 0005619, now this is the contract between Apex and Butler and Young. It's 116 pages long.
Sorry, can I interrupt there? There's no contract between Apex and Butler and Young.
None?
No. The Apex were appointed. We made the recommendations for contract award after our tender analysis, but the contract award would have been made by the TMO. The contract was between KCTMO and Apex.
Sorry, allowing for that change, this is a contract regarding, or actually, let's put it slightly differently. If we scroll further into this document, although it's entitled contract documentation, it appears to replicate the specification itself. Now, would that be the normal way in which the lift contractor was told what it needed to do by Butler and Young?
Yes, it would.
And can you help us as to what the appropriate division of responsibilities was between Apex on the one hand and Butler and Young on the other? Was it Apex did the work and Butler and Young supervised it?
That's about the strength of it, yes, I think. Yeah, Apex would design and draw the scheme. We would monitor the drawing process and the procurement process, and they would carry out the site works once the drawings and everything else and the procurement was approved.
Now, Apex were appointed in October 2004.
Yes.
The specification had been finalised in April 2004.
Yes.
Did Apex have any role in the design of the lifts?
Only the design of component coordination in that sense. But the design, if you like, was the spec that we wrote. But they had to coordinate the control panel, the machine that you talked about earlier, and various other, and the door operator and all these other components. So it was their design that coordinated and drew all that.
Did Apex, as during part of that process, or indeed any time during their involvement, raise any concerns as to whether the lifts ought to have been firefighting lifts?
No, certainly not.
Now, in his first statement, Warren Gentner, who was, I think, the managing director of Apex Lifts,
certainly is.
States this, and the reference is at APX 0008774/5. And he says the preparation of the contract, so it's the fourth paragraph down, and therefore the specification of the work was the responsibility of Butler and Young on the instruction of their client. Once completed and disseminated to Apex, there would be no scope for Apex to enter into any discussions regarding changes to the proposed work, design issues and suggestion for alternative plans. Now, in a supplementary statement, which we found at APX 0008783/2, Mr. Gentner clarified that once Apex had been awarded the contract and attended pre-start site meetings, any issues could have been raised at that point, but he maintained his view that...
Sorry, I'm losing you there.
No, so if you just listen, if you just listen to me.
Okay, sorry.
So, Mr. Gentner had set out the preparation of the contract and the specification was the responsibility of Butler and Young. And he went on to say, once completed and disseminated to Apex, there would be no scope for Apex to enter into discussions. Right, stop there. So I'll move on to another thing he said. In the supplementary statement, which we don't need to go to, he clarified that once Apex had been awarded the contract and attended pre-start site meetings, any issues could have been raised, but he maintained his view that issues of compliance with standards were for Butler and Young to consider. Now, do you agree that once the specification had been prepared and Apex had been awarded the lift contractor contract, they could have raised any issues with Butler and Young regarding the specification at pre-start site meetings?
Yes, they could.
Do you agree that despite this, the issue of compliance with standards was primarily a matter for Butler and Young and not for Apex to consider?
Primarily it was for Butler and Young, yes.
I suppose put slightly differently, did you ever have any experience of lift contractors saying to you, we do not think that this proposed specification complies with relevant standards?
I've had them disagree with methodology in the past. I've had contractors tendering saying, we think we've got a better way of doing it. We would like to use this method or that method. That does happen. But I don't think I can remember being told by or written to by a tendering contractor saying that they didn't consider a particular element to be non-compliant.
And certainly Apex never did to you?
No. So.
Now can I turn to the separate topic of completion of the lift project? Now the first lift was completed in August 2005 and the second lift was completed in February 2006. To what extent did the final lifts as constructed and installed differ from the specification?
I can't think of any way they did.
Now, if we can go to APX quadruple 8692/62. Sorry, APX quadruple 8692/65. Now, if that could be amplified slightly, as it is somewhat difficult to see, is that the test certificate for lift H091?
Yes, right. That's the first one, yeah.
Now, if we go to APX quadruple 8692/80. Now, if that could be amplified, if you need to scroll down, please do shout. But that form indicates that the lift was not a firefighting lift. Is that right? If you can de-amplify it, please.
Where are we?
We're looking at little b.
Yeah. That's correct.
Yeah. And the form also says the emergency operations system had been demonstrated to you. Is that a correct reading?
I'm sorry, where are we?
If we look further down,
right.
At G, sorry, I should have given
G.
you. Confirm that the emergency operations system functioned correctly.
Yes, indeed.
You said yes, and that had been demonstrated to you.
Yes, indeed.
Now, how would the system have been tested for these purposes?
What I tended to do during a witness test, I had to be very, if you like, methodical, mainly because my memory wasn't much better now than it was now. It is now. I would tend to ask for, if you want me to go on, like this could take a few minutes if you don't mind.
Well, I suppose putting it differently, your recollection was it was demonstrated to you.
Oh yes, I mean the safety gear, full load, overspeed, and lots of other elements of the gear.
And if there had been any problems or defects identified during the course of that demonstration, it would have been recorded on the form we're looking at the moment.
Yes.
Do you recall any defects, for example, in relation or problems with the operation of the fire control switch?
No, not at all.
After this demonstration had been carried out, did Butler and Young carry out any further tests on the completed lifts?
No, one witness test was normally what we did.
And
a lot of, I mean, it's a lot more than what that statement says. It's a whole day's work.
But you don't recall any problems with the fire control switch?
No, I tested all the functions, all the indicators at every floor by floor, all the. And I remember, funny enough, I do remember testing the peekaboo system on the fireman's control, either at the end of both, or at the end of the second one. I can't remember which, to be honest, but it was probably both.
And when you peekaboo, that is as in the child phrase, the children's phrase peekaboo.
Yes, it's the way the 5588 compliant control works, in that when you arrive at a floor, the doors do not open, as they used to on the old fireman's lift. They stay shut. You operate the door open push. They will open only as long as you've got pressure on that door open switch, so that the firefighter can see that there is no flame or smoke or other hazards outside. And if there are, he can let that push go and the doors will shut again and he can go to another floor. It will only stay open, the door, once he has held his finger on the door open button and the door is fully open.
Thank you. Now, at paragraph 7 of your second witness statement, if we can go to it, it's BUT quadruple 0 0055/4. You said this: in my experience, there were always budgetary considerations when local authority refurbishments were being considered, which, of course, had an influence on the scheme eventually selected. Did budgetary considerations affect the degree of compliance with the relevant standards here?
I can't really answer that. Yes, they would have done. There would have been budgetary considerations in terms of upgrading the list to firefighting control, if that's what you're asking. But the focus of our deliberations and our scheme was to improve the services, the size, the speed, the facilities for disabled. All those things were the focus of the scheme at that time.
Put more crudely and bluntly, did Mr. Steppel ever say words to the effect of, we're not installing a firefighting lift because it's too expensive?
I don't recall what his conversation was fully with Ian. That was the conversation they had. So
But
whether he mentioned
knowledge.
cost or not, I can't say.
Now, just staying in your second statement here and looking at paragraph 8, you said this: the scheme selected and undertaken at Grenfell Tower incorporated enhancements to the usual type of local authority residential refurbishment. What do you mean there by the phrase, the usual type of local authority residential refurbishment?
Well, the ones I'd been involved in previously involved literally a straightforward refurbishment where the car size stayed the same, the basic parameters of the lift stayed the same. It was just an upgrade of control equipment, drive equipment, door equipment. But the spec, if you like, for the lift, the one-page spec for the lift wouldn't be any different. This was a totally different animal because it was, say, increasing. They had a buggy problem, which was frequent towards the end of my working career. Buggies are not pushchairs like we remember. So they are life support systems. And what they found in Grenfell Tower was with small 8-person lifts, one mother with a buggy and a child would fill the lift. And so that when the lift was on its way down, hopefully to collect other people, it couldn't collect other people, but it made the stop because it can't trigger the load weighing bypass because it's not heavy enough. We've only got 3 people, small people, in the lift. So there was a lot of wasted time, which added to the colossal wear there was on both lifts because the lifts were stopping to collect people on the way down that it couldn't do, and then these people who couldn't get in the lift were calling the other lift, and somebody made the remark, I think, that the 18 years of the lift service was equivalent to 30 years in any other situation. So that was the reasons why that was put forward, that the car size would be enhanced, the entrance size would be enhanced, and that would help wheelchair users as well. And all the other facilities for the disabled, the bells and whistles, the indication, the sounds and acknowledgements that people with disabilities expect nowadays.
Mr. Ellis, thank you very much. Sir, I've come to the end of my prepared questions.
Right.
Might I have 10 minutes to see if there's anything I ought to have asked which I didn't, to see whether there are any further relevant suggested questions?
Right. Well, Mr. Ellis, when Council gets to the end of his questions, we always have a break because sometimes turns out that there are questions that have been omitted that ought to be put to you. And there are other people following these proceedings from elsewhere who may have questions they want to suggest. So we'll stop now. If I say 22, do you think that will give you long enough?
Yes.
Well, if not, you can always indicate if you need more time. I'm going to say we'll resume at 20 to 1. If we need more time, well, it might be a bit longer. But anyway, we'll resume as soon as we can and see if there are more questions for you when you come back.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you, sir.
And now, please, go with the usher and don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, please.
Certainly.
Thank you. Right, Mr. Kinnear. Well, I'm going to say 20 to 1, but it's a short 10 minutes, so if you need more time, that'll be all right.
I'm grateful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Ellis to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Ellis, well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you, shall we? Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
There are no further questions, Mr. Ellis. Just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending to give evidence today.
Thank you, sir.
And I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Ellis, on behalf of all three of us on the panel. It's quite quite a serious request to ask people to remember what they were doing, 10 years ago or more, isn't it?
15 years, I think. It's
15 years,
17
yes.
years, most of it.
Yes, so thank you for racking your brains, giving us the benefit of your recollection.
It was tricky, I have to say.
Well, it's been very useful for us to hear from you, and we're very grateful to you for coming to give your evidence.
Thank you, Sir Martin.
So thank you very much, and now, of course, you're free to go.
Thank you. Ms. Kinnear?
Thank you, Mr. Ellis.
Yes, Mr. Kinnear. Now, we have another witness, but perhaps it would be better to start him at 2 o'clock, would it?
It would.
Yes. Good. Well, in that case, we'll break now and we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much.